intent to explore the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to engage in social change work with a special focus on disrupting gender oppression. Thank you for being here today. You are currently in a session called Exploring LGBTQ plus Rape Myths. Just a note, we will be recording this session. We are in a Zoom webinar, which means that your video will not be visible on the recording. However, your name will be visible during this session. We invite you to change your Zoom name to promote anonymity if needed. In addition, please note that we do not have an ASL interpreter for this session. However, captioning is available via Zoom during this session. I'd invite you for this time to use the rename function on the Zoom to include your pronouns next to your name. In addition, Ali, a peer educator at the Center for Women and Gender Equity, Ali Copeland, will be our Zoom moderator today. Ali will monitor the chat. If you have any questions about technology or how to access the Zoom captioning, please use the chat and we will do our best to answer your questions. In addition, Ali will help ensure we are all upholding our community agreement, which can be found in our conference support hub. If at any time you are in violation of our community agreement, you will be asked to leave. During our session, we recognize that the topics being presented may contain potentially triggering or activating content for members of our audience and community. We are committed to honoring the journey each individual takes in healing, so we invite you to engage with this content in a way that is safe and true to your healing. We believe that the topic QTPOC activism is important for our community to engage with fully. But we understand that conversations relating to this topic can include racism, racist violence, examples of white supremacy, homophobia, biphobia, anti-LGBTQIA+ harm, police and state violence, and strong language. We want to create a space where folks can share their stories while doing so in a considerate way. Please feel free to take a break, step away, do what's best for you during these conversations. Now, at this time, I have the honor of introducing our presenters for this session of the conference. We are joined here today by Dr. Jane M. Tucker and Mallory Norris, so I'm going to hand it off to them.
Thank you, Taylor. I am Dr. Jane Tucker, and my pronouns are she and her. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. We're going to be talking about rape myths. As a criminologist, someone who studies crime, it's very important to study rape myths. These are preconceived ideas about rape, rapists, and also rape victims. I developed an interest in this many years ago, and I have tried to pass along that interest to various students who have worked with me as graduate assistants and sometimes undergraduates. So what Mallory is currently a graduate assistant. She just joined us in the fall. She actually graduated with her undergraduate degree and now joined us as a graduate student. And I have been wanting to revisit a past study. So the study that we're going to talk about, the data were actually gathered by Caitlin Mihalik. You see her name on here. She is a former undergrad and graduated with a master's degree from Westchester. She gathered the data, and we are going to be talking about the findings. So I am going to actually let Mallory take over here and start to discuss a little bit about rape and our students' views of rape and sexual assault.
Hi everyone, I'm Mallory. My pronouns are she, her. So just as a little introduction, if those of you who aren't familiar with the term rape myth, they are stereotyped or false beliefs surrounding rape, rapists, or rape victims that include elements of clemency for the perpetrator, denying perceived injury, and shifting blame to the victim. So rape myths as a whole have been studied for over 50 years, but it's only been as of recently, starting back in around 1980, where LGBT rape myths were being introduced. the current study focuses on students' views of rape and sexual assault among the LGBTQ individuals. So before we get into it, just do a little review of the literature. Martha Burt first introduced the term rape myth back in 1980 throughout her studies, and her research led to the creation of what is known as a rape myth acceptance scale. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with what scales are in research, it's essentially just a series of questions that's used in surveys. So because of this scale that was created, it actually led to the development of the most commonly used scale today in regard to rape myths, which is known as the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale. So in a lot of research, it's been found that there's a positive correlation between rape myth attitudes, including sexual conservatism, sex role stereotyping, and adversarial sexual beliefs. Research has further concluded that gender is actually one of the main predictors of adherence to rape myths, and in particular, it shows that men subscribe more strongly to rape myths. And as I mentioned previously, rape myths in regard to LGBTQ populations are still being newly introduced. Now, the focus of this study kind of narrows down to two main questions here. Are college students accepting of LGBTQ rape myths? And also, what factors influence the acceptance of these rape myths? This slide shows two tables that consist of the sample characteristics that were observed during the study. The survey was administered to 140 Westchester University criminal justice students. So if you take a look at the charts, on the left you can see that most of the respondents were juniors and seniors. 130 of the respondents were criminal justice majors, and 9 of them were criminal justice minors. We also included gender identity in the research, which pretty much evens out 75-65. And if you look at the table on the right, you can see that the overwhelming majority of respondents were Caucasian and heterosexual. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Tucker to review the analysis with you guys.
Thank you, Mallory. So the 18-item Likert scale that we used in this study was actually created by the graduate student Caitlin Mahalik, who was credited earlier. As such, this is really a new scale. There is nothing even today that is promoted as an LGBTQ plus rape myth scale. So it was something new, and we weren't really sure how it would hold together in a statistical fashion. But it was composed of 18 questions that was an attempt to assess students' views of rape myths as they apply to LGBTQIA plus individuals. You can move, yep. So just for statistical purposes, there were 140 surveys that were returned. Why sometimes you see an N less than that, it means that somebody didn't fill in that category. So when you're doing statistical analysis, you actually end up with less numbers being in the analysis. If someone, for instance, did not fill out the question with regard to gender, then obviously that's going to drop. So you can already tell that 4 people did not fill that out. So what Mallory and I did is take a look at differences between groups through a process called the independent Ttest. What it takes is their mean scores on the LGBTQ plus rape myth scale. It plots their mean score so that you can see differences between categories such as woman and man, or race, ethnicity, etc. So when you do an independent Ttest, you have to have 2 groups. That's why in some cases we had white versus all else, meaning anyone who is not white, non-Hispanic. So a couple of interesting things to point out. As previous tests of this nature go, it was shown that men, if you look there, had a higher mean on the scale, meaning that they more highly subscribed to these rape myths than women did. Their mean was 28.72 versus the mean for women in the study. And if you look over to the right, the alpha, which is the 0.001, that means that was statistically significant. that difference between men and women was statistically significant at a level where you can have over 95% confidence in these results. We did not find any differences. That's why it says NS on the next variable. We did not find any differences between race and ethnicity, although you can see that people who were not white, non-Hispanic, actually had a slightly higher mean on the scale, but it was not significant. Religious affiliation, we had a variable that accounted for religious affiliation. We ended up having so many categories on this that we collapsed it into people either have a religious affiliation or don't. And as you're going to see, that was statistically significant. People with a religious affiliation had higher subscription to rape myths. I do want to point out that there is a big diversion between religious affiliation. There was 107, whereas there were only 29 people who said that they did not have religious affiliation. Therefore, we're not going to put a lot of stock in that because those groups are not equal. We can do other testing to show, but because of the level of significance, I can say that religious affiliation does make a difference. I'm going to skip to the bottom one, career choice. In our discipline, we have a number of career choices. Generally, probably just under 50% of our students are going to go in some type of law enforcement, either police or probation officer or corrections officer. All those would be under the umbrella of law enforcement. As you can see, that was not significant, which was sort of surprising to us. So perhaps breaking that down in a little bit more categories would help. That was not significant. But I want to go back now to the gay family and friends. We had a question about, do you have gay family or friends? So we grouped people into either yes, they do, or no, they don't. And found out that individuals who said yes, they have gay family and friends actually had a higher mean on the scale, meaning that they subscribed more to LGBTQ rape myths. And I remember going back to Caitlin's findings years ago as well, questioning this, because it would seem that if you have gay family and friends, you would be more sensitive, right? But we sort of came to the conclusion that you can't group yes to gay friends and yes to gay family in the same variable. You have to separate those out because one is a choice. Your friends are your choice. You choose your friends, you don't choose your family. And those of us who are in the LGBTQ community can say that our families sometimes have not been the most supportive or receptive. So it's probably not too surprising that in this particular case, it was found that people who said yes, they have a gay family or friends actually had higher subscription to LGBTQ plus rape myths, and that was statistically significant. So we had several statistically significant. Gender was not surprising. Religious affiliation, there are many religions that are very anti-LGBTQ community. So that was not surprising. The gay family and friends was, but we think it might have been the collision of two variables that probably shouldn't have been in the same question.
Okay, I'm going to take over, Dr. Tucker.
Okay.
There were a few notable findings. There's basically good news and bad news that was found in the research. The good news is that the overall acceptance among college students at Westchester for LGBTQ plus rape myths was low, which is not surprising because Westchester has a great diverse population of students, staff, and faculty, so this is awesome news. The bad news, however, is that gender still remained the strongest predictor of the subscription of LGBTQ plus rape myths. As Dr. Tucker touched on, the affiliation with the religion positively correlating with rape myths is not necessarily a shock, but may be something that we can look more into in the future and kind of break down into categories to see if we can figure out why exactly this relationship exists and stemming from where. The study did have a few limitations. We had a small sample size, as I mentioned previously. We took students from Westchester University, so we're already only looking at one university out of plenty to pick from, and we're even narrowing that down even further by choosing one department, the criminal justice department. So our sample size is already pretty limited. Another limitation is that the data that we used was inherited, so we could not manipulate the questionnaire construction whatsoever. And this essentially means that we couldn't go in and add questions, remove questions, alter how they were asked, or where they were listed in positions on the survey itself. So that was another limitation. And finally, this was the first time that this scale was even being used, so there's not a lot of room to look for validity to see if it's a reliable source. And Dr. Tucker, if you want to touch on the implications and the next slide as well.
Okay, sure. Going back to the what was referenced on the previous slide with gender, why that's important in the criminal justice field is many of our law enforcement officers are identify as men. Right now in America, about 78% of police are male. So it's important to know what the feelings are about LGBTQ rape myths, because in this particular discipline of criminal justice, our students are going to be serving members of the LGBTQIA plus community. And it really could go down the whole line of criminal justice. If a person who's investigating the crime of rape of a person in the LGBTQIA community subscribes to some of these beliefs, it's possible that they're not going to take it serious or take the appropriate actions. Funneling further into the system, the prosecutor, the attorneys that are working on a case, the judge, the jury, and all that sort of feeds into if we have subscription to LGBTQIA or any rape myths for that matter, we're doing a disservice to the victim. So one of the reasons we wanted to jump in on this first gender justice conference is Mallory and I are going to be attempting to revisit this study in a way that we're going to hopefully have a much larger sample. We want to try to do a study, kick it off in the fall, and we're looking for some feedback and maybe collaboration with other disciplines or departments. It would be really nice to be able to compare and contrast what are the differences between CJ majors and other majors. We also want to further refine some of the variables. This started off as a project for a master's student. So if we could further refine things like religious subscription, instead of just asking if they subscribe to a religion, maybe go a little bit further and find out their religiosity for a different way of describing it. Measure how strongly do they adhere to their religious tenets, because I think there is a difference between somebody who says I'm Catholic and somebody who actually, you know, practices Catholicism and goes to, you know, mass and that sort of thing. People can say I'm Christian, but never have stepped a foot into a Christian church for years. So it might break that religious connection down somehow. And of course, as talked about, we'd like to separate out the family and friend variable and test it alongside some of the traditional rape scales. I've been looking for any LGBTQ rape scales. I did meet someone at a conference, I believe she was from Sweden or Switzerland, who was working on one of these scales, and supposedly it was going to get published, but I have not been able to find one. So it would be interesting if anyone out there knows of a rape myth scale that applies to other than heterosexual or heteronormative populations. So we would be open to any ideas, feedback,
Yeah,
collaboration.
Dr. Tucker, we actually have two questions in the Q&A. One being, why do you think men subscribe more to rape myths than folks of other genders?
I think part of it is cultural stereotypes. I mean, if you look back at the history of our country, and I teach a course called Sex Crimes, it was very difficult to even prove any rape early on in this country, right up until about the 1970s. I mean, you're looking at a culture that puts men on a pedestal. Women couldn't even own property until I should say, they could own it, but once they got married, all the property had to transfer to men. Women couldn't even be the signer on a credit card until what, 1973, I believe. So it has to do with the social construction of gender and gender norms in this country that go far back before our time. The fact that the man is the ruler of the house, a man can do whatever he wants to his wife, and it's not considered rape. Believe it or not, that idea even persisted into the 1990s. I remember being on the street as a police officer, and one of my fellow officers didn't believe that a woman reporting rape, that it was valid because it was her estranged husband. And we're talking 1993. And I had to, have a little talk with him off to the side. So these are very long time ingrained beliefs. Some of them are associated with religious beliefs.
And then there was one more question. It says, how can we introduce a kind of curriculum teaching to move away from our subscription to these rape myths?
That's a good question. I have personally been trying to integrate issues of gender and sexual norms into my classes, but I have to say, in the criminal justice department, we are way behind. I don't recall, I actually was coming here for a master's. I won't tell you which century, but I came here for a master's, and there were no courses other than women and women in the criminal justice system, and basically it went over the various roles that women can have, from victim to being a practitioner in the system. It didn't really discuss issues of gender and victimization and sex roles, etc. So I think we have to start from the basics. As there are guest speakers at the beginning who wrote the book, we have people coming to college who really have not had a wide variety of education on what is gender, what is sex. So I think it has to start there. We have to get our students on a level playing field. One of the things I do in my sex crimes class is, in my first class, I try to introduce as many words that people are afraid of. I try to just blurt out words that you're not really allowed to say in your house. Sometimes in some households, parents, avoid saying certain words or talking about sex. And I try to sort of flood that right in the beginning, because I want the students to feel safe, that they can say anything in this class about sex and sex crimes, because we can't really get to a discussion of sex crimes and what's wrong with investigations of sex crimes if we can't even talk about the terminology. So I think it has to start with a more broad-based look at what does the student know about sex and gender and sexual orientation and gender identity as they're coming into the class. Because believe it or not, some of these concepts are very new. I can tell you from my experience, I went to a Christian undergraduate college, and even though I would like to think I had some knowledge of sex and sexual terms, I had never met a gay person in my life. And I can tell you that the only reaction I had ever seen to gay women was my sister saying gross when we were in a mall and two women tried to hold hands. But I ended up at a Christian college and meeting my first girlfriend there. So I had really very little exposure, and I know there's still people that come to our campus and have really little to no exposure to anyone outside of their sexual and gender norms.
Dr. Tucker, we talked about this the other day. Do you have the survey on hand? Somebody asked if we could share some of the questions.
Yeah, I have had permission. I don't know if Caitlin is on here, if she's gonna pipe in here. Caitlin Mahalik, but previously she has given me permission to disseminate the questionnaire. So as long as whoever wants it will make sure that her name is attached, I can, if you want to send me your email, I can disseminate it to you. Anything else? Any other questions?
Yeah, I just got one. It says, our keynote speaker talked about introducing sex education before college as a way to prevent assault. Do you think exposing folks to queer and trans identities might help to reduce the buy-in of these myths?
Absolutely, absolutely. As far as myths with traditional rape myths as well, I think that would reduce the buy-in for traditional rape myths. If you think our colleges have been giving what I think is fear-mongering lessons when students come to college, instead of empowering women, they say things like, don't leave your drink unattended, don't do this, don't do that. And then when an assault happens, that victim internalizes it and says, well, it's my fault, I clearly didn't follow the rules. It would be a nice day if we could just say, how about have a class for people not to rape and not to sexually assault each other, right? That should be the class, not the class on how to escape college without having been raped. It's my 2 cents. I try to bring that home in my sex crimes class. I ask the male students or men, I say, how many of you have been pulled aside by your parents and had a discussion on, you know, how to walk back to your car in a dark parking lot and that sort of thing. And the individuals in the class who identify as men generally have never had that conversation, but 99.9 of the ones who identify as women have had that conversation.
Another question states, what are some ways we can support survivors of sexual abuse if they are experiencing self-blame or blame from others?
One thing I think is to listen to their stories. Having a survivor be able to tell their story is actually very empowering, even if it's told in an anonymous fashion if they don't want to be out with it, but that can be very empowering. To me, self-blame takes a lot of work. When people blame themselves, we see this also in cases of child abuse, is victims tend to blame themselves, and that really takes a lot of internal working through. And I think that's something that they might benefit from going to therapy. But the more people that can openly and non-judgmentally listen to a victim's story, I think that empowers them to sort of release those feelings of guilt and self-judgment. By the way, I'm not a therapist. Just a little disclaimer.
I think that's all the questions that we got.
Are there any other questions? You can put them in the chat. I do have a question. Since I did take your class, I took the sex crimes class with Tucker. I'm wondering with this information for the people in the group, how does the criminal justice system still perpetrate or reinforce these rape myths that we just talked about today? And in ways that it can change or that we still need to change?
Well, one of the ways that they reinforce it is, truthfully, in my experience, I can't say this is overall, but in my experience, one of the number one questions when I was investigating a rape, one of the number one questions from other law enforcement officers was, is it a good job? And by that they meant, is this real? Did this really happen? We don't ask that of people who are victims of armed robbery. I never had a fellow officer say, hey, is your victim lying about that? So why is there this belief that women are going to make this up and lie about it? And I had to often put my fellow officers in their place about that and say, it is, until it's proven otherwise, in my view, it is a valid complaint, and I'm going to investigate it just as thoroughly as I would any other crime, until there comes some sort of reason to not believe the victim, which is very, very rare. In my experience of all the victims that I worked with, there were only 2 actual false complaints, and by sitting with that victim for a few hours and going through the process, they would actually then confess that they had done this because they were angry about something. So false complaints are actually, the national average that we know of is under 10% of complaints are false, and usually they're, nobody is harmed in those false accusations. On my 2 that I had, there was not even an arrest made or a suspect made contact with. We were still in the very beginning steps of the investigation. In my opinion, those people, victims who are reporting it falsely, have other issues going on, right? There's probably some other mental health issues going on, or they have anger issues about something. So it's not harming me as an investigator to sit there and listen to their story and know potential suspects are disenfranchised through this. And I'd be, you know, obviously we're willing to do that because most of these complaints are going to be factual.
One question, you touched on it briefly, but from a law enforcement perspective, what changes can we make to empower survivors to report?
I really think there has to be more training for law enforcement, for survivors to report. In fact, I would be in favor of pulling it, the reporting of it, away from law enforcement, more to a social worky combination, social work with law enforcement, so that women feel safer to be able to come forward. Because when you have a law enforcement, again, is 78% male. If you're in a smaller community, it's even higher. So imagine a rape victim having to go into a police station and report this to a man who may subscribe to some of these rape myths. It's not really a type of environment that's very supportive. So I would even say that perhaps having, well, we do have sexual victims units that are specially trained for this. So having more sexual victims units, maybe not even at the police level, maybe at the prosecutor level, that might help people come forward better.
And then this last one says, have you ever considered pairing an LGBTQ rape myth acceptance scales with other scales? For example, ones that evaluate consent to see if there are correlations around that knowledge.
I have not considered that particularly, but yeah, that would be a good idea. The rape scale that we used, in my opinion, was a little bit too predictable. And I think some of the questions were phrased, and I had given this feedback to Caitlin when she first proposed it. They were phrased as if when I'm reading it, I might say, oh, well, they're trying to see if I'm, subscribing to rape myths. So I think something that could be a little less predictive might help.
We do have a question in the chat. I am a GSA advisor for a high school. I am also learning support teacher for criminal justice. I would really like for criminal justice students to create an assembly for the end of the year. I would like them to peer advise. Do you think this would be helpful, and what type of information should we emphasize?
Okay, so you're looking to get a group of our criminal justice students together? Is that what?
It's for a high school, but I'm not sure. I'm waiting for them in the chat
Okay.
to be specific, but they're just looking for ways. No, mine are from TCHS, so I'm guessing that's from a different area. So they're just
Let me see.
looking. Oh, it's in the chat, but yeah.
Okay, peer advise on what? Peer advise on rape myths? On rape myths, it says rapists, but if it's peer advise on rape myths, I would just maybe do a lesson on rape myths and how they're socially constructed. Oh, how to get students prepared for college. Boy, that's hard, because what we're trying to stay away from is the fear mongering, right? The fear mongering that happens when people go off to college. Be afraid because you're potentially going to be assaulted. 1 in 7 women is assaulted on a campus. So it would probably be better to have some sort of education on having autonomy over one's body, right? Knowing when someone comes to campus, they need to appreciate the fact of whether or not they want to engage in sex, and have the right to tell people not to touch them, and that they have the right to say no to sexual activity. Sort of veer away from that fear mongering of it's going to happen, so here's what you can do to try your best to prevent it.
I think one way too, just some advice with that, is talking prior to like looking into the precautions and safety on campus, like, knowing where public safety is and things like that, kind of that intro stuff they do in your college, but trying to be proactive in a way, but not just for one specific gender, like for everyone to think about this.
Right, and someone mentioned the book Sexual Citizenship. So yeah, there is a good starting point right there, talking about coming to college and getting people on the same page. Unfortunately, this is another field. Am I going too long here? Do I have time?
I think about 5 more minutes.
Okay. I am trying to work on trauma-informed education within our department and within criminal justice in general. I think a lot of disciplines could use trauma-informed education. When we talk about trauma-informed education, a lot of times we're talking K through 12. It's all the rage there. What a lot of people don't think about is that when students come to college as a freshman, often it's their first time leaving their family environment, where things may have not been hunky-dunky. They could be from an environment where there was family sexual abuse or other types of domestic violence, etc. And literally stepping on the campus is the first time they've been away from that. And what we know about trauma in the brain is that we stay in this protective cycle of sort of protecting ourselves until we're able to be in an environment where all of a sudden it comes out. All of a sudden people disclose as freshmen, sophomores that they've been sexually abused, that they have been victims of domestic violence. And that's where all the trauma starts trying to work itself out. Sometimes it ends up in some acting out and some substance abuse issues. And as a professor, and I think all professors on campus need to be open to this idea that we have students that have come from trauma backgrounds, and we need to be understanding of that and helpful and supportive in giving them the resources that they need to work through that and become productive citizens. I know some faculty members do not want to really know too much about their students and what's been going on with them. It does take a certain personality to be open to some of these type of things and dealing with trauma-informed education. But when we receive students as a freshman, they are very young in their process, and this may be their first time on campus ever thinking about sexual orientation, gender orientation, etc., and sex for that matter. So there is really a lack of education, and unfortunately it's sort of put in our lap as professors once someone gets here to campus.
All right. That was the one in the chat. We just answered this question based on the data, correct? I just want to make sure this question got asked. Based on the data collected, do you have any recommendations how to decrease the acceptance of race myths in general? I think we just asked that one.
It really through education starts with, trying to define what is gender, what is orientation, etc.
Okay, and there's also, we have actually a few more minutes. I'm sorry, I thought it ended earlier, but there's a question in the chat. How does the criminal justice system incorporate intersectionality? Intersectionality is coined by Kimberly Kenshaw about the how different identities intersect and how different levels of oppression are at play.
How does the criminal justice?
How does, I guess it's how would the criminal justice incorporate the intersectionality?
I would have to say, if I'm going to assess it, that the criminal justice system doesn't do a very good job of incorporating anything with regard to gender, intersectionality of pretty much anything, including race. Our criminal justice system is based on a misogynistic society from the very get-go. And not only misogynistic, but if you go back, it's a racist system. The system literally comes out, as you know, Taylor, you've been in my classes, we talk about the first police were slave patrols in this country. They predated organized police. So I would say the criminal justice system really doesn't do a good job of intersecting with regard to race or ethnicity or sexuality. As a person who has worked in the system, I can tell you that as a person in the LGBTQ community in a medium-sized department, I was literally the only out gay person for quite a while in my department. So they really have had a trouble keeping up with modern society on any issues of race, gender, orientation. I know that's a rather critical view. When you look at some really large departments, they're doing great things. Philadelphia, one of my friends is one of the first out transgender officers, and he has helped them develop policies towards how people should be treated, and policies against discrimination in that department. So we haven't done very well, and I'm hoping that part of this is educating, the newer generation.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat, and it's, do you know of any departments that do diversity awareness trainings?
Diversity awareness as far as racial diversity or any diversity?
I guess both gender diversity and as well racial diversity. They said any.
Okay. I know that there are many departments doing racial and ethnic diversity. However, I would assume that more departments are including LGBTQ issues at this time. Philadelphia definitely does a lot of trainings, and they actually have an LGBTQ plus ally and alliance within the department. They have the Gay Officers Action League as well. And there are supports out there for LGBTQ plus police officers. It really comes down to the officers themselves. In my opinion, police officers, before they're hired, should have some sort of test on their beliefs as far as equity, racial equity, and homophobia, etc., because that's all part of you're policing a community. And how can you police with any equity if you're harboring issues against people based on their race, ethnicity, gender identity, etc.?
Thank you for that. Is there any more questions? Put them in the chat, feel free to. If there's any more comments from y'all, we do have a few more minutes. Molly, do you want to say what the
What brought me into this work? I've been interested in criminal justice since I can remember. I remember in first grade when they ask what you want to be when you grow up, and I'm like, I want to be a canine cop. So it's kind of still what I'm interested in. I grew up surrounded by family members that were in and out of the system, so I have just personal history with it and wanting to make a difference for my own, I guess, my own satisfaction. But I've always been about criminal justice system because it needs work, and it's something that it's basically up to people of my generation and current students to try and tackle, and that's something that I'm also very passionate about. Like I said, I've always been interested in this. I love working with people and helping people and trying to make sure everybody's living every day that they can to the fullest, and that everybody should be given equal treatment, especially in the court systems as well. So it's always been something that I've had a passion for.
Thank you. If there's any more questions, just put them in the chat. But I want to thank you both so much for being here with us, Jane Tucker and Mallory Norris. We really appreciate it, giving us this information and having this discussion with us during our Gender Justice Conference.
Thank you very much for having us. And if anyone out there would like to work with us on the future project, we're going to hopefully put an IRB together to be approved by August. And if anyone has any recommendations, feel free to reach out to me at jtucker@wcupa.edu.
Also, real quick, there's another Q&A question for me. It says, considering what you've learned from this research, how do you imagine this might shape your future research or projects? I think that it's very important that a lot of, I guess, aspects in the criminal justice system aren't necessarily brushing upon LGBT community, and I think that it's extremely important. And like I mentioned earlier in the research, rape myths in regards to LGBTQ populations are just now being introduced. So I think that a lot of my research going forward is going to focus on sexual orientation and LGBTQ populations, just because it's such an undermined topic, I guess, and there's literally next to nothing. Like, Dr. Tucker and I are working on our own research right now, and even when I'm doing like my own literature review looking for articles, it's still so hard to find a plethora of data and sources in general. So I'm definitely going to gear it towards LGBTQ stuff.
Thank you, Mallory. That was really good. If there's any more questions, just put them in the chat or in the Q&A. We do have a few more minutes, but I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. So if there are any more questions, please put them in, but I do want to thank you both again so much for being here. So
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. I don't think Caitlin ever made it, did she? She was going to potentially stop by.